former treasurer of the Oklahoma Republican Party and the vice president of regulatory affairs at the Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association, A.J. Ferate.
Thank you. Good morning. It is still morning. It's hard to believe after all the great speakers that we've had this morning. After 2 years as a board member working on this conference, I want to thank you, the attendees that are sitting out here in the audience. Those of you watching online, thank you very much for your involvement in this conference. It's truly appreciated. I also want to do something very quickly. I want to say thank you to my shipmates in the Navy and those who have stood a post in other services. Thank you for your service. It's very much appreciated. We have an extremely important topic to talk about today. And it's one that's going unreported or lesser reported, but is nonetheless one of the more significant things that could affect the way that we do business and live in the United States. In 2008, as a candidate, President Barack Obama, then a candidate, was caught on audio, and he said at the time, quote, "If you want to build a coal plant in these United States, fine by me. I'm just going to make sure that you go bankrupt trying to run it." It's sorry news. Unfortunately, the impact has been even worse. With coal and natural gas plants primarily running our country's electric generation, the EPA's plan would significantly harm and curb any benefit from that. EPA's order would require that the states follow their instructions on the carbon mix and the generation that would occur. If they don't, the EPA will come in over the top and tell the states what to do, a federal implementation plan. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Obamacare. We were told the same exact thing with Obamacare, weren't we? So, EPA's plan, let's go through this clearly, would violate its statutory authority. It would violate state primacy over its electric choices, and it would also violate the Constitution. So there must be some significant benefit that EPA is coming up with as a result of all this. Well, the EPA actually is stating that we will see a benefit, a fraction of a degree in reducing warming. Global warming, we will get a fraction of a degree in cooling, not over 1 year or 10 years, but over 100 years. Impossible to measure. The impact will obviously be a reduction in power generation. So during the summer and those months, the impact would be that when you flip on your air conditioner, there might not be power, and so you'll have brownouts and blackouts. We have two amazing experts to talk with about this topic today. The first one I'm going to bring up is named Tristan Duncan. Tristan is a constitutional law and energy law attorney with the law firm of Shook, Hardy & Bacon in Kansas City. The important thing, or probably the biggest issue that she's working on right now, is she's working on behalf of Peabody Energy. And she's also working for Peabody Energy with somebody that might be interesting to President Obama, his constitutional law professor, Lawrence Tribe from Harvard University. These two are actually working in opposition to Obama's plan. Let's welcome her to the stage and hear what she has to say. Thank you. Next up, I'd like to introduce Attorney General Patrick Morrissey. General Morrissey's worked vigilantly on behalf of the citizens of West Virginia, but more importantly, he's led a 15-state effort in opposition to this plan that's currently before the D.C. Circuit. Let's welcome to the stage Attorney General Morrissey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wherever you want.
All right.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming and joining us. And let's just jump right in. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, why don't we talk about the impact the power plant would have, or the power plan would have, if it's not declared illegal in states like West Virginia?
Absolutely. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to come here to talk about this very important proposal. Let's be clear. The Clean Power Plan is a clear power grab. Absolutely. Now, when you look at this proposal, it's really sweeping in its scope. States are being asked to come up with, on average, reductions of 30% over a 15-year period. That's just staggering for the state of West Virginia and many other coal-producing states. As many of you know, West Virginia is the second largest producer of coal in the nation. So we see a number of very pernicious implications that come out of this proposal. Let's start with number one, jobs. Just yesterday in West Virginia, several coal producers announced that there could be 1,800 direct jobs. People are going to be laid off. That's significant. When you look at the fact that for every direct job in the coal industry, there could be 7 indirect jobs, that could have a significant impact on Appalachia. That's not good. Second, electricity prices. What happens when you retire all these existing coal-fired power plants? Well, you have to build new non-coal-fired power plants. Who pays the bill for that? You do, the ratepayers. So this isn't fuzzy math. Consumers are going to pay an awful lot for this proposal. The reliability of the power grid. Currently, coal represents approximately 40% of the national energy supply. You can't simply just move from 40% to 30% to 20% without seeing real impacts on the reliability of the power grid. So we're deeply worried about that. And last, but certainly not least, I'm deeply worried about the implications of this proposal on the rule of law. The fact is that you can't take an obscure provision of the Clean Air Act and try to radically transform the American economy. At a minimum, Congress should be the one to act on this. So there are some very severe implications with this proposed rule.
Tristan, can you give us a high-level summary of the constitutional issues, some of the legal concerns that you've been arguing, and some of the issues that we're looking at here?
Sure. The EPA's rule is based upon a rarely used, little-known provision called Section 111D. And the problem that the EPA has is that the plain text of this statute prohibits what they're trying to do. Most significantly, Section 111D explicitly says that if EPA has already regulated a power plant under a different section of the Act, then it cannot also regulate pollutants from the same plant under Section 111D. It's a specific statutory prohibition, and that prohibition is intentional. Congress intended to prohibit double regulation of the same plants to prevent burdensome and unnecessary and inefficient costs on the power plants. So that's problem number one. That's hurdle number one that the EPA has to get over, a big statutory prohibition. But it doesn't stop there. In addition, the EPA also is facing constitutional problems with their proposed plan. In fact, we think that the EPA is attempting an unconstitutional trifecta. They're trying to grab power from Congress, they're trying to grab power from the states, and they're trying to grab private property for a public use without just compensation. And the upshot of all these constitutional questions, these serious constitutional questions with the EPA power plan, is that it triggers a rule of statutory interpretation. And that rule is what's called the constitutional avoidance doctrine. And the significance of the constitutional avoidance doctrine is it says that when you're construing or interpreting a statute, you must construe it in a narrow way so that the agency isn't engaging in excessive overreaching. And when an interpretation effectively triggers these constitutional problems, the courts stop that. The courts say, no, that's not the appropriate interpretation. And so, in short, we believe the EPA plan has multiple problems, both at the statutory and at the constitutional level.
General Morrissey, can you walk us through the history on this a little bit? And I suppose my prime question is, have we ever seen this used on such a broad scale?
No, we really haven't. In fact, if you go back to the establishment of this provision in 1970 for the Clean Air Act, this Section 111D provision has been invoked 4 times. Since the amendments to the Clean Air Act that were put into place in 1990, They've tried to move it through a couple times. They've succeeded once. What's really important here is they're taking a provision, which I would add is not even included within the U.S. Code because everyone virtually acknowledged that it was a clerical error, and they're trying to breathe life into it. But you know what this provision actually did? It barred the double regulation of coal-fired power plants. So that's why what's happening here is truly illegal and is unprecedented. And in all the years, I think that we've seen regulatory proposals, none have been so sweeping both in terms of its scope and its illegality.
General, kind of playing off that a little bit, can you talk about what makes the power plant so different from typical regulation, traditional pollutants?
A couple things. One, it's really important to think this proposal as regulating from plant to plug, from the power plant all the way to your home where you gain electricity. And one analogy that may be helpful to think about this, just to really understand the full sweep of this power grab, is an analogy we heard just recently from a well-respected attorney. And they argued that the EPA's claim here is analogous to when it's regulating auto emissions. It's trying to reduce auto emissions. It would suggest that when you're trying to regulate in that area, you would have the ability to force people to go to work on the bus or to buy electric cars because it would have the effect of reducing auto emissions. Well, this section of the Clean Air Act does not allow that type of approach. And that's just one reason why we think it's so problematic.
Well, and in fact, what General Morrissey is touching on captures, or there's a metaphor that's used in a lot of the Supreme Court cases that captures this idea. And it's basically that Congress doesn't put elephants in mouse holes. And what that means in this context is if in Congress intended for an unelected executive agency to wield expansive and transformative power over our economy, a clear elephant, it would have said so expressly and would have given it a fitting home in, for example, an enabling statute, a statute that has breadth and scope that's proportionate to essentially the power that Congress would be giving the agency. What it would not do is lodge that kind of power in a small and obscure provision, which is like Section 111D, which is essentially the statutory equivalent of a mouse hole. So what this is essentially an elephant in a mouse hole, something that the Supreme Court typically regards with skepticism.
Mentioning the Supreme Court, can you follow up on that a little bit? I'm sure there's some case law out there to this topic that's instructive to the example we're facing right now.
Sure. So some of the constitutional arguments that we've been making include drawing upon the line of cases that relate to federalism, and in particular, a doctrine called the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. And that doctrine basically says that our form of government is a government that divides power between the federal government and the state government. And the state governments are regarded as co-equals. They are co-equal sovereigns to a large extent. And when a federal government or a federal regulatory agency essentially commands or commandeers or dictates to the states the implementation of a federal regulatory program, that is not treating our states with equal respect. That's not treating them as a co-sovereign. And in fact, some of the descriptions that are used in the case law is that the federal government acts in that situation like a ventriloquist who is manipulating a puppet, or Attorney General Pruitt, your Attorney General, who is also leading the fight against the EPA power plan with General Morrissey, analogized it to the EPA essentially treating the states like a vessel for federal will. So what is the real significance of this? It's not just a formal label of anti-commandeering. It also has a very important functional purpose. And the functional purpose is that ultimately the purpose of federalism also is to protect democratic principles. So that, for example, the democratic principle that's at stake here is when you have a federal regulatory agency creating a policy but forcing the states to essentially implement it, that puts the people who are on the receiving end of that policy in a position of not fully understanding who is really coming up with these policies that are going to increase our electricity rates, that are going to potentially drive jobs out of our states. Is it the state officials who are the ones that are the closest to the people, and will the people essentially translate their dislike for these policies at the ballot box, ousting those public officials, rather than who's really behind the policy, namely the federal regulatory agencies? That destroys the kind of transparency and accountability that we expect in our democratic form of government. And so those principles are at stake here as well. There's been some talk in the press and in some court filings that, well, there's some states who agree with this, who want to comply with the federal plan. But there's an interesting case called the Prince case that has an intriguing discussion of whether or not states can actually agree with a federal policy that essentially destroys divisions of power between the federal government and the state government. And the argument goes something like this. It basically says that, look, the division of power between the federal government and the state government is enshrined in our Constitution not for the benefit of the states as states, but instead for the benefit of the people. The idea is that we don't want any government, any one level of government, essentially aggrandizing their power to the detriment of another branch of government. Why? Because the division of power ultimately protects individual liberty, we the people. And so for that reason, what's at stake here to a large extent is that kind of structural protection of our division of power in order to protect individual liberties. And here's why it's particularly relevant here, and what's so different about the EPA plan as compared to other traditional forms of regulation. Traditionally, the EPA can regulate emissions at a plant, within the confines of the plant. But that's not what the EPA is doing here. What the EPA is trying to do here is go beyond the fence line and also regulate persons and matters outside the confines of the plants, which are within the police power of the states. And that creates some real problems, because the EPA does not have preemptive power over those matters that are within the jurisdiction of the states. And so, General Morrissey, I'll turn that over to you, because I think you can flesh out why that's so problematic for the states.
Yeah, there are a couple reasons. I thought Tristan did a nice job explaining some of the legal issues at stake here. But one thing that people are going to have to pay attention to later on this summer, the President and the EPA will likely announce something they'll call a federal implementation plan to go along with the Clean Power Plan. This has to occur, from their perspective, in order to force the states to do their bidding, which, as Tristan indicates, is really going to be violative of the 10th Amendment and the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. If you see this FIP in place, you could see significant implications and massive changes in store, depending upon what state you live in. First, states are going to have to pass sweeping new laws to come into compliance with this federal implementation plan. Second, there could be constitutional issues. Every state has a different constitution, and every state exercises its police power differently in terms of how it manages its energy portfolio. So there could be huge questions in terms of the relationship between the federal government and the state government. And then, of course, we get to this question of consumer behavior. One of the more pernicious parts of this proposed rule is that it would actually allow the federal government to reach down and affect consumer demand for energy. I'm not even sure the federal government and Congress would have the power to do that directly, but this is something that's traditionally been left in the power of the states. We're going to have to look at all those issues very closely, but if they finalize it based upon what they're talking about now, we think there could be a very serious constitutional defect with this proposal.
Touching on that, yeah. The Obama administration seems to think they can do whatever they want, almost as if they're a king. Tristan, is there any limiting principle to this executive power that Obama's trying to implement?
Well, the absence of an obvious limiting principle to the EPA plan is, in fact, an excellent point. It's reminiscent even of the famous broccoli example in the Affordable Care Act case, when Justice Scalia asked the Obama lawyer whether the federal government could force everyone to eat their broccoli or buy broccoli. Here, the upshot of the EPA's argument is that it too can wield such vast power that it can essentially tell you that you have to stop using your electric toothbrush or stop using your stove to cook your broccoli. So the upshot effectively is that the EPA thinks it has enough power that it could tell you to eat your broccoli raw and in the dark. Pause on that for a moment. So if you thought it was alarming for Congress to tell you to eat your broccoli or eat your vegetables, then you should find it doubly alarming that the EPA here, which is an unelected executive agency, is trying to do the functional equivalent with respect to how we heat our homes and turn on our lights.
General Morrissey?
Yes, well, I don't think this administration believes it has any limits on its executive authority and that there are any limiting principles. And I think the evidence for that goes across the issue spectrum, whether you're talking about healthcare, the ACA, all the missed deadlines and the flawed interpretations that allowed that to go forward, immigration. We're seeing right now that a Texas district court had struck down the immigration's policy. And of course, here in the environmental arena, we have the Waters of the United States rule, which is going to severely change the relationship between state governments and the federal government and expand federal primacy over navigable waterways. And then, of course, we have the Clean Power Plan. And I think it's very difficult for this administration to establish a limiting principle on something that goes from plant to plug. If you take the administration's logic to its logical conclusion, it basically could allow them to step in and say, if you have a 2,800 square foot house, you're allowed to consume X amount of energy. Or perhaps you might have to turn your lights off at 11 o'clock at night. There literally can be no limiting principle with respect to this proposed regulation, and that's just one reason of many that it should be struck down by the courts.
I don't know about any of you, but listening to these two, I really think we need to do everything we can to stop this plan. What do you think? I want to thank both of my experts for coming on stage today. Tristan, General Morrissey, thank you very much for your time. It was very informative, and you have our backing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.